then in the context of you're talking with activists, and we'll get to this to the Arizona special election in a minute, but that's very interesting to me because it strikes me that if activists are exerting some of that power, and let's not overread it, but at the same time, someone like Cory Booker representing New Jersey with his political record, the simple reality of him not taking pharma money is actually a small sea change in American politics. There's no doubt about it. On the activist side, what I'm wondering is, do you think that there's a perception from that sort of success and pressure that not only do they need to keep it up, even if, say, Bernie's elected and you have an actual for real progressive president, that because the forces basically of corporate oligarchy are structurally aligned to benefit in this country against broader public interest, that action and pressure is going to need to be continuous. And does that also, you think, some of that same energy that gets applied electorally, do you think that some of these activists are also thinking about more broadly, like what are all of the things that we need to bring to bear on this? Protest, exposure, local action. I guess what I'm saying is there a sort of, in this resurgence of action and some of the results that it's getting, do you think on the activist side it's also getting framed to include but extend beyond even like the game of Democratic Party politics?
Oh, interesting. And yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I can tell you that like some of that's certainly the labor fight in Arizona, for example, that it cut the other way.
Yep.
Where activism on a non-electoral issue had electoral spillover effects for Democrats there, and probably will continue to do so if they can keep this heat going. And there have been a number of Oklahoma state legislature seats that have flipped even before the Oklahoma teacher strike, where that was a factor very clearly. So do I think that if a factory shuts down and they're thinking about it, and it's in bankruptcy deliberations, and you've got a hot Democratic primary in that district, that someone's going to see that, and that's going to then, or that activists are going to mobilize on behalf of a particular candidate, and then that's going to be an existing core for labor to take advantage of, or something like that. I assume we're talking about labor. We're talking about criminal justice, grassroots activists, and everything like that.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I haven't. I don't know that I've seen it yet go the other way, in the sense of having moving the needle electorally, reaping benefits for people in kind of like public policy fights, social movement type fights. Maybe actually, maybe the best example of that is in the case of Dominion Energy in Virginia, which I spoke about on this show, where you had this blue wave at the state legislative level, and it's all these little tiny groups, Network Nova, Network Northern Virginia, which is like, we can basically think of all these groups as indivisible groups. They're reading the Indivisible Guide and, the hashtag resistance, and they include like sort of dyed-in-the-wool lefties and kind of more run-of-the-mill Democrats, and even some people that are maybe just pissed off at Trump.
Yeah. Is
that they were able to really reform, like sort of tighten up and buck the Democratic Governor Ralph Northam, or not necessarily buck him, but force him into a position where he was signing an energy regulation bill that was a lot tougher and blocked this issue of double dipping by the utility companies, precisely because they had this existing network from the mobilization in November for the election.
Right. I think that's exactly what I would be. And I also just want to add to the mix too. I think I think what Larry Krasner is doing as DA in Philadelphia is also really sort of putting even more pressure if you're running some type of particularly left campaign where you're going into some type of executive position. Basically, I mean, he's setting a roadmap of like, I'm delivering. Right? Like I didn't, campaign on all this stuff and now I'm in office and I've got to placate all these other interests. Like I'm just doing it. And I actually think in a certain way, it doesn't, it's not, I mean, it was national news again yesterday because of Meek Mill, but I think he is also a kind of subtle sort of prompt and raising expectation levels across the board too. But let's get to Arizona. I believe it was Arizona's 8th district. Republican there was just reelected, but a radically decreased margin. Talk about that. Who were the players?
Yeah, so, okay, it wasn't a re-elected Republican, but Republicans held the seat. It was an open seat because Trent Franks, one of the sort of staunchest abortion opponents in the United States House, an incredibly wealthy former oil executive, actually. And these are in kind of like I guess you could say like, it's an area of Phoenix suburbs. It doesn't include any of the city of Phoenix, but it's Phoenix suburbs that include places like Sun City, which is basically like a planned golf course community for people 55 and older. So we're talking about generally middle class to wealthy retirees.
The type of place that like Jamie on our show is planning on retiring to. A Arizona built golf course.
Yeah, it sounds like
community.
me.
Yeah.
Very eco.
Very eco.
Because Arizona has a ton of water,
right.
And it's great to play golf there.
Right.
Yeah, so
Super
it's actually
sustainable.
called Sun City, which has South African parallels. I know you'd appreciate Michael.
Yeah, exactly. I did notice that. That's kind of terrifying. Yeah. What do we call this place that we want to exclude minorities from and have a man-built white golf course closed city on? What was a place that people wouldn't perform at in the 80s? Oh, got it. Right.
No, it's and then they built, and there's another town called Sun City West. So, that this is kind of the character. This is not Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania's 18th, where the kind of grandpa figure of organized labor, just, you can still occasionally get him up off the couch,
Right.
Metaphorically speaking, like labor wasn't really a factor. It was also not a very diverse district. But you've got old folks, and you've also just got like some ordinary people, some of whom probably don't always vote in elections like this. And Trent Franks had to resign in December in disgrace, really at the urging of Paul Ryan, because he apparently pretty creepily approached at least one of his female staff members about being a surrogate mother for him and his wife.
Oh, he was the surrogate mother guy. Oh, okay. Right.
And he's like this extraordinarily wealthy oil multimillionaire. So he was just like, I'll give you $5 million. And maybe the creepiest part of it is that, and that there was apparently more than one conversation about this, but apparently like one of the creepier parts was it wasn't exactly clear whether he wanted it to be like a sperm donor type situation or just like a handmaiden sort of thing, Handmaid's Tale.
Yep.
Where the Bible says you can be my concubine, just to carry my child.
It's in the Bible. Right.
Yeah. And so, whatever, that has all the different implications. He's like the 40th House Republican to either announce they were retiring or resign suddenly this year.
Right.
And basically, the Democrats had their own little primary. Actually, and this is something I didn't really write about at all, but there was a transgender woman, Brianna Westbrook, who's also a car salesperson, who apparently some activists credit her for pushing Hiral Tipirneni, the physician and healthcare advocate, ever so slightly to the left, though I've heard that disputed. And so you have this candidate, someone who immigrated with her family from India at the age of 3, grew up in Ohio, has been living in this district though for 21 years, public school parent, and was an emergency room doctor until about 10 years ago. And as Republicans point out, she was sued for malpractice. Frankly, that's like pretty common, I think.
Yeah, that's not. I'm a fan of the trial lawyers in a lot of ways, but I mean, if you're a doctor getting sued for malpractice is not. Yeah, that's actually fairly typical. Doesn't mean maybe she did do something wrong, but that doesn't stand out. Right. And it's pretty ironic that Republicans like who doing everything to make sure that people, doctors, insurance companies, and hospitals can do whatever they want. It's a pretty rich line of attack for them, but whatever. Yeah.
Right. Totally. And, so they had this whole thing like, oh, she's appearing in scrubs in her ad. It's like, gotta dust those off, but whatever. And then they had this, since then she had been working for a nonprofit sort of advocating cancer research in her, still using, her doctor capacities. And she was running against a conservative former state senator, kind of like a very, I think, very typical post-2010 sort of, and I think that I'll look to see exactly when she came in to office, but, this was someone who, to me, represented, so she had been a member really since 2009, so not exactly the Tea Party wave, but extremely conservative, tied to conservative billionaire money for sure, was the lead sponsor of a private school voucher bill in the Arizona State Senate, sort of the whole nine yards, anti-abortion, very much embodies the Obama-era red state, just gut state government public spending attitude, and just to cut taxes and to privatize things.
Right.
And so it was a matchup between Hiral Tipirneni and Debbie Lesko, and this conservative person. And I think what was so interesting to me, and I didn't, it wasn't necessarily the headline of my coverage, but when you're looking at, as I really do in everything that I look at, the sort of Overton window, the acceptable policy discourse window moving in the United States, here you had someone, Dr. Hiral Tipirneni, someone who was a physician running in a district that Trent Franks had won by like 35% the last time he ran. It was almost, I think the nominee against him in 2016 was a Green Party member. I mean, the Dems hadn't even nominated anybody. That's how ridiculous this district was.
Right.
And Trump won it by 21 points. So there was some, you often see this phenomenon of like, clearly there were Republicans who couldn't stomach Trump in that district. But still, you're talking about a very, very conservative district. You're not even really talking about a working class one in like the Rust Belt or something like that, where you can kind of do a jujitsu sort of move.
Right.
This was, and she basically said, look, I'm a doctor. I've seen how medical healthcare is practiced in this country, and I just don't think that the private insurance companies are going to get their act together unless we create real competition, and real competition would include a public option for all, a Medicare buy-in option.
Right.
And to me, that was remarkable because she identified as a moderate Democrat. She told me this. She's like, oh, I'm a moderate Democrat. I'm data-driven. I'm a scientist. But in terms of her actual policies, she was for Medicare buy-in, and she only lost by something like between 5 and 6 points in a district that Trump won by 20 points. So I think that's incredibly significant. And she also leaned heavily into defending Social Security and Medicare,
yep,
which is interesting, and maybe politically expedient in a senior-heavy district. But as you know, 5 or 6 years ago, that's not even happening in a district like that. That's not something that Democrats were embracing.
Not at all. So, so the kind of 3 big lessons that I'm hearing are like, first, yes, this isn't the type of district where, you can sort of make just run a Bernie-style campaign, or even in Conor Lamb's case, yes, he was right on guns, on abortion, which are, and even on abortion, he wasn't actually running on legal, on making it illegal. He was actually just culturally signifying that he's personally opposed, but not actually in any way committed to changing the legal status of abortion. But and I remember I was on a panel on some a TV show after this, and the Republican guy was all over the place with, well, this was an anomaly, and Conor Lamb was, he was anti-Pelosi and anti-guns and pro-guns and blah, blah. And I was like, I basically said, I was like, dude, he was talking about labor unions raising wages and social, like that was his campaign. It was actually all economic populism, and that made a big difference. But this wasn't that kind of district at all. There wasn't you called it the jiu-jitsu, this sort of move of the judo move. But then at the same time, like, what is defined as moderate is getting really, radically expanded. And I think, the irony of it is if you go back to Obamacare, even people like Jacob Hacker at Yale, right? They really were saying that basically, like, yes, the public option is a thing that good, at least like actual liberals want because they care about public delivery and they understand that the healthcare industry is dangerous and pernicious. But the way this thing is designed and the complexity of it, a major part of it stands on having a public option. So it is interesting that she's just sort of going back in some ways to just that, like a genuinely data-driven position. Not one that sort of talks data, but actually just sort of is political amelioration. Like that's actual data. If you want to pursue that kind of approach to healthcare, sort of a managed care, regulated, competitive market, it's not going to succeed without a public option.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty interesting, and you can then say if you make it like sort of like this is just an option, you don't need to talk about the price tag either.
Right.
It was sort of interesting to hear because it's then just like, oh well, people will just pay premiums like into it. She wasn't talking about it like being the same exact Medicare program for those people. But the Republicans were kind of interesting on this because they saw this as like a huge soft underbelly. I mean, they leaned hard into, like, I mean, her opponent was like, basically, you're Bernie Sanders. I mean, she literally said that in a televised debate. Mm-hmm. And all the experts say Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan is going to cost $32 trillion. And the NRCC, which elects Republicans to the House, was telling me like, yep, we're stomping out single payer. This is just another. She'll be the first single payer advocate to lose, but certainly not the last.
Do they say it like that too? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it wasn't like Bradley Whitford and Billy Madison, but or Jay Moore. I forget who the actor was, but it was Moore. Like, yeah, right. But like it was like it was literally a quote like that. I can't even. I don't have it in front of me, but it was like she'll be one of many single payer advocates, and it's just like, okay, so they're reduced to talking to everything like single payer, and I didn't even heard like Connor Lamb, who wasn't even talking about a Medicare buy-in. They like in his I heard like the state Republican Party chair at some event there being like, it's socialism, single payer, and sanctuary cities. It's like, nah, like, it just, it doesn't resonate when it's clearly not true, but B, maybe it just doesn't resonate. And, I think a really interesting test case of this, Michael, will be races like Randy Bryce's, because Randy Bryce is interesting in that he's running in a difficult district. I think, prior to Ryan's resignation, it was even higher, like more difficult. I'm sure that he and his campaign wouldn't even like me saying this, but I think in some ways, a lot of the establishment support that he got was about giving the middle finger to Paul Ryan, and that he's getting support from everyone, right? He's got NARAL, he's got now the DCCC and Citizens United. These are groups that are more associated with the establishment arm. And of course, he was recruited by the Working Families Party, and he's endorsed by Our Revolution, and on and on and on. And I think the people that are really excited and driving his candidacy are still progressive activists. But I almost feel like national DC-based Democrats were kind of like, well, he's almost sort of like, yeah, we got this really authentic blue-collar guy that we can pit against Paul Ryan. Isn't that a nice little narrative turn for us?
Right.
Whereas now it's like you don't have the Speaker of the House in there with $11 million in cash on hand who can just raise millions, with the snap of a finger. This is looking like a real race, and you have the situation where the D-Trip basically, I think, was forced to deal seriously with them because of how much money he raised. That one of their red to blue candidates is just not only an out-and-out Medicare for All advocate, but an abolish ICE guy.
Yep.
So that's, I think, and I'm keeping my eye on a bunch of those. One dynamic that's interesting and that I'm thinking about writing about is that because you talk about this kind of cohort of Senate Democrats that is really, and by the way, just talking about Kirsten Gillibrand, if she is, sort of just putting it on, or really kind of, if it in any way is, look, we know that it's politically expedient, but if it in any way doesn't reflect her values, that she hasn't actually moved in terms of her core convictions, I will say from having spoken to her, she's damn good at sounding like it.
Right.
And that was not something that you could say of Hillary Clinton, for example. Hillary would check the box.
Right.
She'd be like, oh, now I'm against TPP. And it would be in like some press release, and but like Gillibrand is like, no, like not everything should be for profit. What has this country become? So I mean, she was saying things like that to me. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. But what's interesting to me, and it may be a function to some extent of gerrymandering, it's a function to some extent of the election year thing, is that these big, ambitious, progressive ideas are coming out of the Senate and not the House.
Yeah.
And it's the House campaign arm, the D-Trip, that is doing all this sort of like heavy-handed intervention in primaries with what I think is a very narrow idea of what an electable candidate is in general election. To be fair, as I know, this is an election year for the entire House, right? This is not every 6 years. I mean, a lot of these people have a little bit more leeway,
right,
and they're dealing with Republican gerrymandered districts. But it just seems like when you've got Hiral Tipirneni, who, for all of the challenges that she faced in the district, and frankly, for better or for worse, the attacks that they were able to land against her, from her personal and professional history. Again, I don't put any stock in them, but those were things that maybe someone like Conor Lamb didn't have working against them.
Right.
You have her coming within 5 points on a Medicare buy-in, and House Democrats are like, nah, we got to run, like a veteran who hates deficits.